let's talk a little bit about the 1970s. 1970s were a pretty interesting era where a lot of things kind of came to be. Now there was a kind of a renewed or maybe an initial kind of move towards recognizing the environment as a legitimate issue. In 1962, there was an author by the name of Rachel Carson who wrote a book called Silent Spring. Silent Spring warned about the use of DDT. It's a chemical that had detrimental effects. And again, this is something that really hadn't been seen a lot. A lot of concern with the environment. So producers of DDT try to discredit Rachel Carson, kind of again saying she's a woman and didn't know what she's talking about, not a very good scientist. But state governments listened. A lot of states outlawed the use of DDT as a toxic chemical. So Silent Spring kind of started this move of environmentalism. The government kind of followed suit by creating the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, which created a lot of regulation for businesses. Government had a wave of regulation that regulated like clean air to make sure companies were acting responsible and what pollutants they were putting in the air. And then government actually in the 70s created Earth Day. That's when it first kind of made its appearance. So something that we kind of all know pretty well from present day. So the environment was a big issue, a bigger issue than had been seen previously. There also was a move towards consumerism, protecting consumers from companies, selling them bad goods, defective goods. A guy by the name of Ralph Nader, who actually would run for president a few times with the Green Party. We're going to probably talk a little bit about the election of 2000. Ralph Nader played a really big role in that. Not so much that he was going to win, but a lot of people feel he directly influenced the outcome. Ralph Nader wrote a book in the 70s called Unsafe at Any Speed, basically where he attacked General Motors, more specifically Chevrolet, the Chevrolet Corvair, which was a type of car that when studies looked at the Corvair, they realized that it was prone to tipping over, which is not good. Hence the title Unsafe at Any Speed. No matter how fast you were going, that thing would flop over on you, and that's no good. So there was kind of this push towards protecting consumers from potentially big companies doing bad things. Richard Nixon was president in or at least part of the 1970s. Elected in 1968, 1972, then would win re-election for a brief stretch before he resigned. Richard Nixon has a couple kind of big things happen. We're kind of putting this section a little miscellaneous hodgepodge of what's going on. Richard Nixon was president right when the Supreme Court was dealing with a couple of big issues. The first one was integration of schools. We talked about this before we left. Brown versus Board of Education in the 1950s was decided, ending school segregation. However, the Supreme Court was very vague in their directions to when these school districts were going to have to submit a plan to integrate their schools. A lot of southern school districts got very confused on how to make that happen. There was a lot of issues that would pop up. So they were really dragging their feet as long as they could to keep schools the same way they were. In the 1970s, early 1970s, a lot of southern school districts still hadn't integrated. So really, in essence, Brown versus Board of Education almost didn't happen for them. It was a series of other court cases that kind of pushed this idea of integrating the schools in the South. One of the ideas that the court kind of pushed, or that people were pushing, was this idea of busing, where you'd have a black neighborhood and a white neighborhood, and you'd bus black and white kids to the different neighborhoods to kind of mix up the races. So there wasn't these integrated schools. A lot of whites were not thrilled with the idea of busing. A lot of them for racial reasons, obviously the racist attitude of not wanting to go to school with black kids. The other reason was, and this one a little more, I guess, justified, was it was inconvenient. If I have a school down the street, why do I want to bus a half an hour to go to the one across the tracks? There were some African-American families that didn't love the idea of busing for that same reason. By and large, there was much more support for busing on the African-American side than there was on the white side, for sure. So the idea of busing kind of took root during the early 1970s, and a series of Supreme Court cases made a lot of southern school districts end their segregated practices. The odd thing that really comes of this era, this idea of busing and integration, because the southern school districts were the ones that were doing the separate but equal, having white schools and black schools, because they're the ones that were in violation, the courts made them integrate their schools. At the end of the day, like present day even, there are more mixed integrated schools in the South than really there are in the North and probably the West. It's something called de jure segregation by law, something that no longer exists. Busing and integration did away with that. However, there's a lot of school districts in the North that have what's called de facto segregation. Again, not illegal, it's based on where you live. So if there's a neighborhood that's all black, white, Latino, whatever, you are going to have a school that's all black, white, Latino, or whatever. So in the North, because they weren't forced to take proactive steps towards integrating their schools, they do have a lot of times a de facto segregated school. Interesting kind of side note, I suppose. The courts also had some pretty big monumental decisions in the 70s. Big one is Roe versus Wade that made abortion legal, at least during the first trimester. If you're not familiar with pregnancy, first trimester is the first 3 months. And then states could weigh in the second and third trimesters, putting restrictions and regulations on as they see fit. So the idea of Roe versus Wade, decided in 1973, has been a pretty big Supreme Court case that has gotten a lot of attention ever since then. The other thing I want to kind of throw in there is Richard Nixon and his foreign policy. The big thing was Richard Nixon had this idea of what's called détente. Détente literally means a relaxation of tension. And he was trying to get this relaxation of tension with the Soviet Union, and he was pretty successful actually doing that. Enters into some agreements, actually goes and talks to some of these people. He actually goes to China, talks to the Chinese, and kind of comes up with, again, some agreements, some trade agreements, and does relax the tensions in China. And I know a lot of people want to focus on the negative aspects of Richard Nixon, the Watergate, but this idea of his foreign policy with relaxing tensions and kind of moving kind of the ball down the field when it comes to the Cold War, he actually is a very, very successful president in that regard. So he does a pretty decent job when it comes to that. Okay, if you have any questions, please let me know. Other than that, I will be talking to you.